at the far end of a tired grocery store with flickering ceiling lights and shelves that hadn't seen a restock since the last storm. 22-year-old Devin Brooks stood behind Register 5, trying to stay awake on his third double shift of the week, his red vest rumpled, his name tag crooked, and a small packet of instant oatmeal in his pocket, the only food he could afford until payday. But he wasn't complaining, not with his mom back home needing insulin, his little brothers struggling to pass 11th grade, and rent sitting 2 days overdue with a landlord who didn't believe in grace periods. And across town, people were posting about brunch and bills paid online. But Devin kept his head down, scanned the barcodes, and smiled at customers who barely looked him in the eye, until the store's automatic doors creaked open, and in walked someone who made everyone pause. An elderly woman in a ragged wool coat dragging an old cart behind her, shoes duct-taped, gray curls blowing in the wind from the heater vent. And her name was Miss Eunice Hargrove, 81 years old, living alone since her husband passed 3 winters ago, scraping by on a pension that vanished too quickly every month. But she held herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd raised 3 sons, worked 40 years at the post office, and survived enough hardship to know when eyes were watching her with pity. And as she moved slowly down aisle 5, people moved out of her way like she carried disease. But Devon watched her with careful curiosity as she placed a small loaf of bread, a tin of beans, and a package of dinner rolls into her cart, each item handled like it was made of crystal. And by the time she reached his register, the murmurs behind her had started. Someone whispered, "Why doesn't she just order delivery?" And another scoffed, "She always holds up the line." But Devin silenced it with a glance, gently took her items, scanned them without haste, and said, "$6.85, ma'am," and Miss Eunice nodded slowly, her hands shaking as she reached into the inner pocket of her coat, pulling out a carefully folded square of tissue, which she unwrapped with reverence to reveal a collection of coins, some so worn you could barely see the mint year, and she began counting them out. 1 nickel, 2 dimes, a couple of quarters, even a foreign coin that must have slipped in long ago. And when she stopped, the total was $6 exactly, and her face crumpled as she whispered, "I thought I had enough." And behind her, a man groaned and rolled his eyes, a teenager snapped a photo, and a woman 2 carts down muttered, "This is why I hate coming in the mornings." But Devin didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't let the moment pass. He simply reached into his own back pocket, pulled out 85 and change he'd been saving for the vending machine, and quietly dropped it into the till, tapping the total button as if it was nothing, and said, "You're all set," handing her the bag with both hands as if he were passing her a crown. And she looked up at him with tears forming, lips trembling, and whispered, "Bless you, young man," before turning to leave, head bowed against the murmurs that clung to her like smoke. And Devin thought that was the end of it. Just another day doing what felt right in a world that forgot how to. But what he didn't see was the girl in the candy aisle filming the entire moment, or the man near the freezer who stopped walking when he saw Devin reach into his own pocket. And hours later, as Devin mopped aisle 3 after closing, his phone buzzed with a message from his cousin. "Bro, you're on the news." And when he tapped the link, he saw a grainy phone video of himself paying the difference. The caption reading, "This grocery store cashier just taught the world a lesson." And within minutes, his phone exploded texts from friends, co-workers, strangers, pastors, bloggers, even an email from someone claiming to be with a national talk show. And the next morning, when he returned to work, the store was surrounded by cameras, customers clapping, and his manager, who usually avoided eye contact, shook his hand and said, "Head office wants to talk to you." But before he could even clock in, a black SUV pulled up and out stepped Charles Devlin, former city councilman and director of the Eastwood Foundation, who walked straight to Devin, handed him a letter with a gold seal, and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Brooks. You're the first recipient of our Human Kindness Fellowship, $25,000 in grant money, full college scholarship, and a job offer in our community outreach program." And Devin stood frozen, eyes wide, because he'd never even dared to hope for something like this. Not when he barely made it through high school while working nights, but even as the cameras flashed, his eyes searched the parking lot until he saw Miss Eunice, now wearing a new coat someone had donated, standing quietly behind the crowd, her eyes wet again. And when he ran to her and hugged her tight, she whispered, "My husband would have done the same. He always told me kindness comes back when it's needed most." And Devin nodded, unable to speak, because that morning he'd almost quit, almost decided none of it mattered, but now strangers were calling him a hero. and soon the story reached national news. He was flown to New York for a morning show, where the host read letters from people saying he restored their faith in humanity. And one was from a little girl who wrote, "I want to be like Devin when I grow up," and Devin cried, live on camera, because all he did was give 80. But that one act made ripples in places he'd never even imagined, and months later, when he launched the Brooks Basket Initiative, partnering with grocery stores to set aside emergency change funds for people in need, he made sure every location had a small plaque with Miss Eunice's name, because she was the reason it all started. And years later, when he stood on stage receiving a national medal for civic leadership, he held it up and said, "This belongs to every kid who gave their lunch money to someone else, every cashier who helped someone quietly, and every elder who reminded us that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right." And in the front row, Miss Eunice clapped through tears, wearing pearls her church ladies gifted her, and beside her sat Devin's mother, now healthy, his brother, now in college, and behind them were hundreds of people who had been helped by the initiative. And Devin knew then that the world didn't change in grand speeches or sweeping laws. It changed in the tiny quiet spaces where someone saw another human's need and said, "You're worth it." And that moment behind the register, when the world wanted to turn its back, was the exact moment the story of a lifetime truly began.